Blood to whoop this bitch, nigga.
I think that too, my nigga. Come on.
Welcome to Boys in the Hood TV. Today we're gonna be discussing the life of OG Mob James from the MOB Pirus. Now James will be born in 1965 in South Central. And in 1973, his family would relocate to the city of Compton. Now as a kid, he along with his two other brothers, Timothy and Alton, will all have a close relationship growing up. Now in 1976, James and his brothers would all attend Foster Elementary. Now as a kid, James was always getting into fights on a daily basis. And by third grade, he would get expelled at Foster after punching his school teacher after she tried to take him to the office. Not only was he having trouble in school, but outside of school, he was getting bullied and picked on. So one day, James would head back home, grab a couple kitchen knives, and come back up to the school and wait at the playground for the kids to get out of school. Once he saw his bullies, he would then start chasing them around the neighborhood with knives. But the trouble didn't only stop at school with the bullies. He also dealt with trouble at home with an abusive father who would whoop him, not only for getting in trouble for school, but sometimes even when he had done nothing wrong. One of his beatings were so bad that he had to be taken to the hospital and having the top of his head stapled. Now by the age of 12, James along with his brothers would start hanging out on the block around the older guys at Ludus Park. Now one kid in the neighborhood he would see every blue moon was Marion Knight, also known as Suge. Now Suge was hardly around in the neighborhood simply because his mother would not let Suge hang out on the block. Now throughout the neighborhood at this time, James was known as Lil Mac. He was also known for riding the block, carrying a baseball bat, which was broken in half. Now because of his wild behavior, he would be bounced from school to school due to constant fighting. Now at the time, the East Side Mob was beefing with most Compton Crips, but one of their main rivals was the Santana Block, who were extremely active in the city. Now around 1980, James and a couple homies, while on the block, will be approached by Crips from Palm Oak. Now as James and his homies were about to square up to fight them, one of the Crips would pull out a .38 and open fire. And James will be shot in his chest. Now he would luckily survive his injury, but after being shot, the dynamics would change and James would no longer carry that bat. He would now get a hold of a gun. Now from this point on, James would turn his gangster all the way up and he would officially get put on to the mob. And one of his homies named Michael Rose will give him the nickname Mob James. Now just like elementary school and junior high, James would have trouble staying at one high school due to his behavior. And this would lead to him trying to enroll into Dominguez High. But the day of enrollment, as his father is inside the office signing the paperwork, James will be outside fighting the Crips. And immediately, his enrollment will be terminated. So the next school he will be sent to will be Centennial High School. But at this point, James no longer had any interest in going to school. So what James decided to do was to grab his jacket that he got shot in the chest with, and he would cover that bullet hole with the letter CK, and he would paint Piru on the back. So every day, he would go to Centennial High and Dominguez High, simply looking for trouble, trying to start fights. But eventually, James would drop out of high school completely and start gangbanging full time. Now this reckless behavior would have its consequences. And one night, he would return back home to find his little brother playing with his gun. So to teach his brother a lesson, James would grab the gun and point it at him, telling him, what if it had a bullet in it? And that's when the gun would accidentally go off, shooting his brother. Now his brother would survive, but his father would be pissed off and would try to put hands on him. And James would let his father know if his father did try to touch him, it would definitely be a problem. Now at some point in time, his father and his mother would separate and his father would move out. Now violence in Compton would get increasingly worse due to cocaine moving in and also the use of guns. And Mob James would find himself right in the middle of it. Around 1982, James would get news that one of his homies were being jumped by a group of Samoans up at the Compton swap meet. So James would head up to the swap meet to confront them. But little did he know that it was a 12-year-old kid hiding behind a car with a shotgun who would open fire on all of MOB Pirus. And sadly for James, he would be hit, but he would survive. Now, even after being shot on 2 different occasions, this would not stop James from gangbanging or running the streets. It simply made him that much more dangerous. Now, when he wasn't in Compton, James would visit his grandparents in South Central on 81st and Hooper, which was located in the Kitchen Crips hood. Now, James would develop a close relationship with OG Craig Mont's little brother named Runt, from the kitchen Crips. Now, they were known for being super tight and having each other's back if anything ever went down. Now, over the next few years, James would continue to be active in the streets. Now, one night, James would attend a party where they were rival Crips at, and one of the gang members who was in a wheelchair would try to press James and start banging on him. So James, being the gangster that he would knock the dude out his wheelchair, and things would only go up from there. As James and the mob members went out to the van, Crips from inside the party would come out blasting, and it would be an all-out shootout between the mobs and the Crips, and James, in the midst of all the gunfire, would be hit in the back with a 4-5. Yet again, James would survive this injury. Now, with the rise in drugs, Mob James, like many of his homies, would start selling dope to make their money in the streets. Now, in 1984, James and his brother would be kicking it on the block when they would notice a van constantly driving back and forth through the hood. So James started getting suspicious, so he would quickly head back to his house, grab his gun. Now, once he pulled back up on the block, that same van would be seen, and it would suddenly stop at the dead end part of the street. And out of nowhere, the men inside would then open fire. So James and his brother would then return fire back. Now, as multiple shots are being fired, suddenly the shooters inside of that van would stop shooting. And the reason was that one of them had been shot and killed, which was a 16-year-old boy. Now, that van would immediately flee the scene, while Mob James and his brother would continue to open fire. But only seconds later, the Compton police would pull up on the scene and arrest both James and his brother. Now, while at the hospital, that driver of that van would admit to the police that they had planned on stealing the gold Daytons off of James's car. Now, because he admitted to this, both James and his brother would be released due to self-defense. Now, because of the gang violence had hit such a high rate, the city would issue a specialized gang supervision program, which Mob James would be on that list, and any violations would get him sent to prison or jail. Now, in 1986, when James would refuse to go see his PO, this would lead to him violating his supervision, and he will be sent to prison for 2 years. Now, after being in prison for those 2 years, James would realize that this was not the place that he ever wanted to be again. And in 1988, he would be released and be back on the streets. Now, the very next day after being released, Suge Knight will get word and come back to Compton and visit James at his house. And he and James will become super tight and start kicking it every day. Suge at the time will be working security. He will ask James, did he want to come along with him and start working the security job? And James would accept. Now, around 1989, his brother Buntry will be paroled after an attempted murder on a police dog after choking it nearly to death. Now, once out, James will put his brother on, and he would start working with him along with Suge Knight. Now, in the following year, 1990, Suge Knight would partner up with a local record company called Fern Hill Records, and Mob James and his brother and the other mob members would be hired as a security. Now, James would witness the infamous Vanilla Ice incident of Suge Knight forcing Vanilla Ice to sign over all his publishing. Now, this wouldn't be the only incident that James would witness or be involved in, but it was a lot of things that James will be a part of where they would strong-arming a lot of record executives, including artists in the industry. Eventually, James would become the head of Death Row Security. Now, as Death Row started to build their roster, they would attend the Soul Train Awards. Now, that night, Mob James, along with the Piru members, wearing their suits, kicking it in the back of the limo. But also, D.O.C., who was formerly with NWA, was drunk at the time and would decide to hop in the front seat of the limo and take it for a test spin. He would start driving like a madman down the street, nearly wrecking the car and killing everybody in the inside. But once he returned back to the parking lot where the Soul Train was taking place, Mob James would step up and confront D.O.C., who would start laughing in his face, and this would lead to James taking off and hitting D.O.C. so hard, he would slide over the hood of the car. James, at this point, had built up a fierce reputation, and he was respected by everybody. Now, the drama with Death Row would continue to get worse. One night at the Roxbury Club, Suge Knight will get into an altercation with 6 players from the LA Rams who he knew from his time playing football. One of the players would then key his Mercedes-Benz. So Suge Knight would run in the inside, telling Mob James and the other Pirus, who would immediately rush outside and step to the Rams. Out of nowhere, a brawl would take off after one of Suge Knight's twin cousins would punch on one of the Ram players. Now, this brawl would last for a few minutes up until the police would arrive, and one of Suge Knight's cousins would be arrested while still fighting the football player on the ground. Now, Mob James would eventually find himself in deep waters. In 1992, in the midst of Dr. Dre working on the Chronic album, James would find himself being arrested for attempted murder. But due to lack of evidence, the charges would be dropped to an accessory after the fact, and he would only spend 8 months in county before finally being released. Now, over time, James would start playing the back seat and allow his brother, Buntry, to start really working security for Suge Knight because he was afraid of flying, and his job required a lot of air travel. So this would lead to James working at Suge Knight's lowrider shop called Let Me Ride on Rosecrans. This shop will bring in a lot of business, and even one situation, Dr. Dre's car will be dropped off up there to get worked on, and Mob James would decide to steal a car and joyriding it for nearly 3 days around the hood before finally giving it back. Now by 1994, Death Row was the #1 label in the country, but they would be facing a lot of turmoil when Snoop Dogg will be arrested on murder charges. Now at the time of the trial, Mob James will be responsible for posting up outside the courthouse along with other MOB PIRU members. At the time, it had been rumors of some Long Beach Crips who were upset with Snoop Dogg for allegedly not showing love to the city after moving out. So James' job and the other PIRUs were to keep watch just in case any of the Long Beach Crips decided to come up there. Now about a year later, in October 1995, Tupac Shakur would be released from prison and was signed to Death Row. Now this was a chess move by Suge Knight, who already had a deep hatred for Puff, but he also knew that Pac had a deep dislike for both Big and Puff, so he would use this to his advantage. Now Mob James would be acquainted with Tupac and thought he was very talented, but they would have very little interaction. Now this would be due to James not liking how Pac started to move, especially affiliate himself closely with the MOB PIRU members and eventually getting a mob tattoo.
Niggas try to play that gangster, but we MOB for motherfucking real.
Now with all this going on, MOB still had beef in the city of Compton. Now at the time, Mob James' baby mother lived in the Southside Compton Crips neighborhood, and she would start feeding him information that the Southside had linked up with Puffy. Now with this new affiliation with Puff, this would lead to MOB and Southside Compton Crips on a crash course. Now rumors would start to spread that Puffy had put a 10K bounty out on anybody who can snatch a Death Row chain, and it wouldn't be too long before somebody took him up on that offer. In the fall of 1996, the Southside Compton Crips and MOB would clash at the Lakewood Mall in an attempt to snatch Trayvon Lane's Death Row chain. Now after this attempt failed, everything would spiral out of control in Compton, and this would lead to multiple shootouts. But in September, everything would go from bad to worse when Tupac and MOB would pack out Baby Lane at the MGM Grand. Now while this fight is going on at the Grand, Mob James was working security at Club 662. Now about 30 minutes later, while working the door, James would see the Southside Crips pull up in the parking lot before immediately leaving. But only a few hours later, Suge Knight would come back to the club, letting everybody know that Pac had been shot. But ultimately in the end, Tupac would die from his injuries, and things would only get worse. This would lead to back and forth shootings between the Pirus in Compton and the Southside Compton Crips. Multiple deaths would come about due to this beef. Now James would get word in the midst of all this shooting from his baby moms that the Southside Crips were bragging about smoking Tupac, specifically Baby Lane. But at this point in time, it didn't matter. The war was already on and bodies were already dropping. Now once Tupac died, Death Row would slowly start to fall apart, and eventually the war that nobody saw coming would show up on Death Row's doorstep, and that would be the beef with Compton Pirus clashing with each other. And one of the first deaths would be Heron from Ludus Park, who would be gunned down in 1997. Now once Mob James saw the Pirus going against each other, this is when he would start to distance himself from Death Row Records, because seeing his homies going to war was something that he wanted no parts of. But in 2002, Mob James' entire world would come crashing down. His brother Buntry would get lined up by another homie for allegedly having a tape which showed the death of Big V from Fruitown Piru. Now this would lead to Buntry being shot and killed at a gas station in April of 2002, and the death of his brother would break James' heart completely. Now the day of his brother's death, he would grab his AK-47 and was ready for some payback. But his mother would be that calming voice who was able to talk him down to stop him from possibly causing more bloodshed. The violence between the Pirus would still continue, and James would lose even more homies after this. Now by the mid-2000s, Mob James had completely stepped away from Death Row and the gang life. But in 2004, Mob James would be accused of cooperating with the feds to help take down FG from Cross Atlantic Piru in the alleged drug transaction from the early 2000s. Now FG from Atlantic Piru would end up taking the deal and be sentenced to 4.5 years in the feds. Now Mob James would deny any allegations of being an informant or snitching of any kind. Now as of today, Mob James is still alive and well and can be seen online doing interviews on YouTube, on different podcasts. I would like to thank everybody for tapping in. and I'll see y'all next time.